but let's get the ball rolling here. Hello and welcome to Exile and Bookbill's Author on Tap reading series. If this is your first time tuning in, I'm Javier Ramirez, and along with Kristen Gilbert, co-run Exile and Bookbill, an online entity with a physical space coming to a lucky Chicago neighborhood by the end of the summer. So when I started to hear the buzz behind Gina Nutt's essay collection Night Rooms late last year, I begged Eliza and Erica, here's a look at it, over at $2 Rater to send me a copy as soon as they were available. As I began to read and enjoy Gina's meditative and insightful essays, I couldn't help but think how incredibly great it would be to host her. And here we are. Dreams do come true. It was on the top of my list of events to host this year. And I'm so glad that you're both here. Along with Night Rooms, Gina has written a poetry collection, Wilderness Champion, from who published that? That was a Goldwake Press?
Yes, Goldwake.
Correct? Yeah, you're our second Goldwake Press event this year. We hosted Best Winter for Machines of Another Era. It was our first event this year, so go Goldwake Press. And earned her MFA from Syracuse University. Her writing has appeared in Cosmonauts Avenue, Joyland, Ninth Letter, and other publications. Gina will be in conversation with Chelsea Hodson, whose essay collection, Tonight I'm Someone Else, was published in 2018, and she teaches at Bennington College. We will post links for you to purchase both books, books by Gina and Chelsea in the chat. And as an added bonus, we will send along signed book plates as soon as you order those. Should you have any questions or comments, please put them into the chat or use the raise hand function, and Chelsea will field them at the end of the event and relay them to Gina. Please mute your mics, but feel free to leave your cameras on for tonight's event. And when we get to the Q&A session, you'll be able to unmute yourself. I'm going to pass this along to Chelsea for the rest of the show. So grab a cocktail, everyone, and enjoy. Good luck, you guys.
Enjoy. Thank you so much, Javier. Thank you, Exile and Bookville. Thanks to Gina for inviting me to host this, to be in conversation with you. As I mentioned, I'm really excited to talk to you, and I see a lot of familiar faces in our chat tonight, so that's exciting. Someone's mic is on. But I'm like in teacher mode, I'm going to mute you. But anyway, so I wanted to mention, I definitely will open up for Q&A kind of later in our time here. I'll start by maybe asking a few questions, but if you don't want to turn on your video and you just want me to ask the question, but you're curious about something, feel free to put it in the chat at any point. You don't have to wait for anything. If you want to just ask a question, you want kind of me to relay it, I'm fine with doing that too. So feel free to either raise your hand when I ask for kind of questions later on, or just put it in the chat and I will integrate it into our conversation. So I'd like it to be kind of open to people that are curious as well. Otherwise, I will ramble on with my questions. So, but we'll kind of formally open up for questions a little bit later. But I wanted to start tonight by asking Gina to read a little bit from her book before we start diving into our Q&A. So would you like to read, Gina?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chelsea, for joining me for the conversation. And thank you to everyone for tuning in, and Exile and Bookville for hosting us. I thought I would start by reading from the first essay in the collection. I'm going to hop around a little bit, but it's going to take you through the whole first essay with some bits cut out. 1. I used to imagine wanting someone alive would revive them, if caught right after dying. If I went after them, buoyed by reflexive hope, I might bring them back. Like losing something, a bracelet, a pair of sunglasses, a plastic sandal, over the side of a boat, seeing the outline dim as it sinks. I'd flood with instinct, dive into the water right away, head first, to retrieve what was lost. If I look at the sky at the right moment, evening and morning mirror each other. The light, the sky, the air's vague smell. A hazy line blurs the intervals, deepens my readiness to disorient myself, to lean deeper into dreams where I am falling and feel awake. I've become acquainted with the creature feature. Life emerged from lake or sea, an isolated town, a gash in Arctic ice, ugly, ancient, miraculous. Some living things scientists have not yet discovered, some living thing scientists created or found and hid. How body horror wrecks the human form, an infection, a botched experiment, the skin newly revised, a brilliant rash, cracking dryness, molded to accommodate a larger shape, eyes bloodshot or jaundiced, blacked through by change, pupils dilated wide, irises pressed into rings too thin to see, the spine a seam where a costume zipper may hide. I have watched rituals summon the supernatural and accidents awaken ghosts. Someone calls back from beyond the grave. Sometimes they take someone back with them. Zombie and vampire films are familiar, infectious bites and apocalypse templates, eternal afterlife outlines for the undead, survival strategies for the living. Events inspiring chainsaw massacres, summer vacation, a road trip, a cannibal family in a house of hoarded, dusty objects collected from victims. Almost everyone dies. Someone gets away in the end, but not really, because the driver in the flagged down car is a villain, or the survivor goes to a hospital, and when she stares out the window, all she sees is a sunset and a fence, a man in a suit, tie, and white shirt. The man swings a chainsaw at the horizon. The blade splits the sky from the earth. Someone noted as we walked around a city together that I ran across the crosswalk when the pedestrian light changed. Scamper, 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 he sweetly teased. Breaking this habit is tough. My husband knows. He reassures me, you don't have to run. Hands cupped as if asking for a communion wafer, I crept into the kitchen from the garage, approached my mother to show her what I'd found. The mouse was tiny and brown. The mouse was dead. I hadn't known. This is a story I've been told. I don't remember being there. Hearing a memory is like listening to someone describe a movie I can't remember seeing. I remember the afternoon I set a butterfly in a dollhouse. The wings flickered and flattened, a black and orange mosaic like Halloween decorations laid in a box for storage. I ran the elevator, thinking one motion may inspire another, a domino effect, or seeing an object and finding the word to name it. Plate, book, door. Whichever parent noticed may not have said dead, but this is as far back as I grasped the word uniting with the act. On its own, dead seemed inert and distant, different from understanding what it means to die, the feeling of being a witness. The still wings unfolded a familiar fall in me. I sensed it watching a girl and her dog run from a funnel the sky focused on Kansas, an orange cat in a box floating down a river, missing his dog friend, listening to night sounds, a sea witch rising from ocean depths. I felt it when I saw night darken the golf course beyond the backyard, and the photo of a bicycle found without a girl, her school picture in the newspaper, my parents warning someone could take me. The feeling may have been dread, a widening twinge, an ache I felt but could not name. The cartoon Wolf movie is streaming this month. The birthday I turned 11, my mother's boyfriend hauled sound and light equipment from work into our living room for my party. He spelled my nickname in neon light on the wall. A boy with a bowl haircut gifted the cartoon Wolf movie. I added the tape to my family's video shelves and didn't watch it. I still have it in a bin in my basement. I worked for my English teacher during 8th grade study hall, stapled packets and hole-punched worksheets to snap into 3-ring binders. She brought me snowball snack cakes, marshmallow and pink-tinted coconut, a round chocolate crumb. The week the boy with the bowl haircut took his life, I arrived at study hall to work instead of attending the wake with my classmates. My teacher seemed surprised. My mother may have called the wake morbid. By then I knew about my great-uncle's death. A principal dancer for the San Francisco Ballet, he died by suicide during the company's 1969 run of the Nutcracker. I'd researched and written about him for projects and reports because as a young girl, I too was an aspiring ballet dancer. I wanted to hear something different and better understand. I wanted him alive for the brief spell earned when talking about someone who is dead. I play something familiar, a movie or show I've already seen. I repeat seasons. I stopped counting how many times. I don't think I ever counted. I don't call this catharsis. It's closer to the feeling I get watching a slow burn, how the movie expands my capacity for dread as it delays a jump scare or reveal. The composer John Williams says of music and movies, it's one of the beauties of the film medium that it's the combination of the visual and the situation combined with the notes, that combination of sound and image forming a memory. A man approaches a beautiful woman in a mint green bathtub in a vast old hotel. A boy peers over the edge of his bed to gleeful laughter. A swimmer's legs kick through water, deep ocean floor thumping. An orchestra accelerates. No matter how many times I watch these scenes, I still hold my breath. I may be waiting or hoping something different will happen. I know another fin may appear on the horizon. My impulse to think shark when the fin could belong to a dolphin. A woman or girl alive when a horror movie's credits roll joins an ancestry of women and girls who have done the same. They make a lineage of final girls. Each outlasted a struggle knowing she'd die someday, that anyone's immediate survival is only as urgent as the danger before them. A rope split the shallow end from the deep. I sat on the diving board kicking my toes in the water while my brother cleaned the pool. I had on a blue jumper with a whale my mother painted on the front pocket. My brother swept the net through the water. He raised the skimmer, palmed a frog. Reaching for it, I fell in. My dress billowed around me. I saw the sky and sun clear through the water. I didn't think of swimming or drowning. The movements I learned in swim class were taught at the surface. My sinking happened below, too fast to pick a stroke. It almost didn't seem to be happening at all. I let myself fall back, like action playing backward on a screen as a tape rewinds, slipping into the VCR's hum and whir. If we attach ourselves to art, maybe art can attach itself to us. Do I find the movies or do they find me? I am making a lineage of what lingers. I am trying not to be afraid anymore.
Thank you. little quiet applause there for me. That was a beautiful reading. Your writing, I would say, has this hypnotic quality, and it is kind of amplified by hearing you read it. I at times felt like I forgot that I was like in charge of interviewing you after. I just found myself like, I don't know, I kind of in the dream of the book. And I think that is something that resonated for me as a reader. As I continued to read this, I think it just has this dreamlike quality while also, having really evocative, detailed scenes and memories. And it's a really kind of interesting combination. And I really like that that line that you ended with, I'm trying not to be afraid anymore, but also before that, I'm making a lineage of what lingers. It's like you tell your reader what you're trying to do. And I think that's always interesting to me, reading essays or nonfiction, of when the writer just explicitly says, this is what I'm trying to do. And then they can either, succeed or fail. It's like both are interesting to me. So I read a version of this book, I think over 2 years ago now. And I would just love to hear you talk more about the just kind of earlier stages of this book, from just beginning it to publishing it. I think it's gone through a decent amount of changes, and I've seen on your Instagram these kind of post-its that are very meticulously laid out. And I'm just really curious to hear more about your process and how this book kind of came to life.
Yeah, so I started writing the earliest seeds after my father-in-law passed away, I was having like just the worst time trying to keep writing. And I'm someone who writes every morning. I get up and work, and it felt important to still be like coming into my office, but I was really stalling out and spinning my wheels. So I was kind of like, well, I guess I'm just going to write about death. And so I kind of started with uh, that early scene, that early memory of bringing my mother a dead mouse. And then it, which is such a strange thing for it's strange and not for a child to bring a mother a mouse, I guess.
It's strange, but that's one of the things I actually remember from the manuscript I read 2 years ago. You know, it's like that's the kind of thing that really stays with you, and I think says a lot about the narrator, you know?
Right. So I wanted to like delve into that, those kind of strange things that maybe like were a little weird, but I was like, well, maybe I can stay here. And so I was writing about those earlier understandings of death. And then I got into writing about the movie It Follows, which had really, I'd seen it like the year before, and it just like had really resonated with me. So I was like, well, anxiety is like It Follows. And I felt too like this really heavy sense that like in a way suicide had kind of started like following me in different through different family members, a school acquaintance. I was just kind of like, this is something that like is happening a lot. And so I wanted to, rather than like say, well, I'm not going to write about this and I'm going to continue writing playful poems with animals, which would have been fine. I wanted to like, I guess I wanted to dwell and like stay with this. And so I just kept, you know, longhanding in a journal. And then I started going to like a Word doc. And then it started getting to a point where I just had this long, unwieldy doc that I just would, I would just work on whatever felt like interesting to me, following whatever idea. And that's probably when I started doing the note cards that you were mentioning. Chelsea mentioned these Instagram these Instagram posts where I had color coded index cards up on a wall in my office, and I basically organized the different threads of the book. So movies, childhood memories, the present, and I would kind of work between the doc on my computer and all the cards on my wall, and just kind of swivel. And they were up for a year, and I was just moving pieces around. And then there would be times where I would maybe print a stretch of the manuscript and actually like cut it up, you know, cut up the paragraphs and lines and move them around. And it just became this thing that I kept growing and also just kind of lived inside for a while. And you know, I just kept writing about other movies that I felt could relate to particular experiences, but also felt like movies that had like somehow attached themselves to me, or that I had really like loved, or even a few which ended up falling away as I continued writing, that repulsed me, or initially like, you know, I just couldn't stand them. And that to me was interesting. Like, there's something to be said for the things that we can't stand but still think about and kind of obsess over, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
And I think after a while of note cards and cutting things up, like when I had a draft and was kind of like, I want to throw it into the ocean and never see it again. And that's when I was like, I'd read your collection and I reached out like when I saw you were doing consultations, and I was like, hey, do you ever do? I was like, this is what I have. And I felt like totally strange just being like, do you do this? But
Yeah.
it worked out because I just felt like you would get it, and you would see, like, you would know. I was like, okay, she will know. She'll know.
I'm glad to hear that. Because I did like it at the time, you know, and I love what it's become. And I am just interested in your process of this, like, you know, where do those note cards and kind of methods come from in terms of even being able to identify the themes that are kind of lurking within? Does that come as a result of the Word doc, like you're saying, like, you know, do the cards come out of what you're noticing in the Word doc, or are those like a way to map what you're working on in the longer form? kind of curious about that because of the structure of this book. I think it's like, it's really interesting to hear how this came to be.
Yeah, so I think I was at a point I was just like, I can't print out this whole manuscript every time I want to move all these parts around. So the note cards were kind of born from a substantial size Word doc, I would say.
Mhm.
And that's when I was like, okay, I have to organize this into something that I can see on the wall and see, like, is there a larger shape? Is there, an arc to this book? And are there pieces that, maybe don't belong here earlier, but come later? And are there threads I want to pick up again later? And so I think when you're able to kind of map out the book, like it can open up new avenues, but it can also like lend to circularity too. Um, so I think that's what I was hoping. That's what I was hoping for.
Yeah.
um,
Did that make sense to you as someone who's previously written poetry? Like maybe the mapping and the kind of tracking and cutting things out was a way to kind of allow yourself to write this longer narrative?
yeah. So I would do that with poems. Like, that's one way I would organize a poetry manuscript is print up the collection and then move all the poems around. Um, and I worked a lot I did a lot of prose poetry. So it almost felt initially when I was working on that document, like I was kind of tricking myself and saying, you're just writing one prose poem after another.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, giving a pill to a dog, you wrap it in cheese. And it's like, that's kind of like I think that's the only way like I can like commit to something long is if I'm like, okay, just one prose poem after the other.
Yeah.
And it just kind of grew from there. But I do think like that sensibility and just my earlier that poetry background, I think it also like let me feel more willing to fall flat on my face because poetry
Yeah, or
is
just
like
like be free, right? Yeah.
yeah, it's very free and the expectations are so low that it's just kind of like I'll just follow this idea wherever it goes and let it open up. Um,
Mhm.
and that's something I think that it happens a lot in poetry or my experience of poetry, especially prose poems, because it's not like you're breaking a line, you're writing a sentence and the paragraph continues. So I think that's something that really kind of you were talking about like the dream of the book or the rhythm or falling into it, and I think leaning into that was kind of a big engine for me.
Yeah. Um, and then I was curious too, and just in terms of the kind of the dream of the book, the mood of the book, in my blurb, I called your book like really cinematic because apart from including a lot of just literal films and just certain details of films, the prose itself is very cinematic and kind of sets a tone at the very beginning that I think it holds throughout the whole book. Um, and so I'm curious then, how do you approach it of working in certain themes again and again? How do you decide where to kind of turn, make a u-turn back to this thing that you mentioned before? I mean, chronology is kind of strange in this book in a way. It's like, I think the in a good way, I think like you train the reader of what to expect, but the reader never really knows if we're going forward, if we're going backwards. It's kind of exciting in that way. So I guess I'm just curious how you pair this idea of like mood and atmosphere and this kind of cinematic energy in a book, with a kind of narrative anchor that makes them essays or makes it memoiristic. Because I think sometimes some essayists or nonfiction writers can get bogged down with just the chronology, the kind of straightforward story. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I'm just kind of interested in how you think about cohering, pairing these things together, this mood and narrative.
Yeah, so I think for me, it's a lot of trial and error and a lot of overwriting in some cases. So, like, I think there were definitely versions of this book where, like, I was trying to be more academic or I was trying to be more critical. And I mean, I could have probably written that book if I tried really hard.
Yeah.
Um, but I think at a point I was like, that's not me. And I do think like mood and atmosphere is something that I thought about a lot, especially because so many of the movies I'm writing about, I mean, all horror movies, really all movies, full stop, really, I think rely on that feeling of, you know, atmosphere. And certainly like some of the horror movies that I think have been really resonating like in recent years, you know, like Midsummer, like there's just
Yeah.
like a mood about it, or like a vibe, as the youths might say. um
Yeah.
and so I think for me, like when it comes to like, okay, well, how am I going to do a turn, like I think a lot of it is moving pieces around. And you know, a lot of the kind of, oh, there's a turn here, or it's a shift, I think a lot of that ends up happening after the fact, because I do a lot of like just barreling through and drafting, and then I'll go back and like move things. Because initially for me, I think a lot of it is about just getting something out.
Hmm.
And because I'm like working early, I always feel like I'm still like I'm awake, but I still sometimes feel like, you know, like there's nothing else going on. It's just me. And I haven't like looked at the news, or in most cases my phone. And it's just kind of me doing my thing. Um, so I think that too was really important, like coming fresh to the work with like no outside influence, and just like picking up where I left off, or starting something new. Um, and then going back and fixing it later. Um, that's kind of like half of it for me, is like
Yeah.
just get it down and let it be as like
Yeah.
bad and long, and do whatever you want in like the first few drafts, and then you know
And
you
then you
have
can see what's there. I think I totally agree.
I love that,
Um,
like cutting, when you cut away and it's like this is what's left.
yeah. Yeah, it's so satisfying if you feel like, because I think there's like different kinds of writers. There's writers that really need the sentences to be good and make sense kind of on the first draft, and there's others that are just like fine to be free, and the real reward is in cutting it down, and I'm definitely the latter. Like really like kind of paring back.
Yeah. And I feel like too, when you let yourself be free, and when you just let it be as long, and you know, just luxuriate in that, that's when you can kind of unlock some of those weird unexpected
Yes.
turns. And that's when I think it can get really interesting, and when the book can outlive like the project or the initial idea.
Yeah,
Right?
totally. I'm glad you mentioned that because I think that is so important, and I think that's something that I kind of that just resonates in your book to me, of just this kind of fearlessness to sprawl into something else and then turn back, and but there is this satisfying element of, you know, certain subjects returning and certain themes returning. Um, but that kind of, you know, free writing or writing, you know, as much as you want, kind of just freely, is really how uh, I encourage other writers, but also myself, of just kind of getting into that subconscious state where you
Mhm.
don't really know what you're going to say and you don't really know what you really think. And I think that's exciting to me and helps this kind of dream-like atmosphere, in my opinion, because you're kind of daydreaming ideally if you're writing, you know. Um, I wanted to bring some of the chat into our conversation. Adam, I'm going to get to your question in a second, but I wanted to talk about Jenny's question, which seems most relevant right now. Jenny's asking, when drafting and rearranging is so significant in your process, how do you know when you're done? So how do you actually sign off on something? And I know you worked on this for a long time. So how does something feel done? And then something that I had on my list of questions asked too was, you know, how do you know these sections are done? Because to me, each essay or chapter feels like an ending. Do certain lines just feel like an ending? Does the book just feel done? Maybe you can just elaborate on when a piece feels done to you.
Oh my gosh. I wish I had like if I had the answer to that, I would like, I don't know, live in a swimming pool of ice cream. Um, like
If only you
I
had the
don't
answer.
what's that?
Just
What
like,
did you
if
say?
only you had the answer.
Right? But
Yeah.
I also feel like that's the reason to keep writing, is because there's so many things I don't know. And I will say, like, there are essays from this collection that I sent out, like trying to find homes, and you know, it didn't work. And that's how writing goes. And then the book
Yeah.
gets picked up and you're like, well, that's weird. Like no one wanted
Like, I've
like
had tons of
8
rejection. Why
pages.
do they like it? Yeah.
Yeah. It's like no one wanted these 8 pages. And then like this person's like, we're gonna do the book. And that's just really funny to me. I don't know. I'm not an editor for these places. So But in terms of like, how do I know I'm done? It's a feeling more than anything. And I think, it's what I said earlier, like I want to throw it into the ocean. I never want to see it again. But then what's
Yeah.
funny is like, if it does get rejected, or even if it's like, okay, we're coming back to it, I remember in edits, like even from like the arcs to the finished one, I was like getting in my last edits, I was like, this sentence,
Yeah.
and like being so picky. I feel like I could revise something forever, but you do have to like stop yourself and say, you're gonna write other books and you're gonna write other essays and poems. But for Jenny's question, I'm thinking about like how to be helpful. So I think more than anything, it's like a sense of like peace with the work. Like you can put it away.
Yeah.
Like if you would read it in front of people, that's a pretty good, like if you would read it and not feel like you need to crawl under a chair and hide your face, that's probably a good indicator.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty solid way to tell if you feel like something's ready.
Yeah, I feel like the more time, Jenny says thank you. The more time you spend with your work, the better instincts you have about it, where you think, yeah, that's the last line. Like I never thought that in the first several years I was writing, but now I can write something and think, yes, that's the last line, because it feels like a last line to me. So I think like it's the kind of thing that's really maybe impossible to fully describe, a process of how you sign off on a book, because I think most writers are in your position of not really wanting to sign off and still editing in those last pages or those last kind of rounds of edits. But I think that's helpful. So Adam has a question of, what do you think about and how do you deal with the unreliability of memory when writing about your own past? Do you think it's important to report or try and get across how things happened as they did? Or are you okay with kind of our biased perceptions of ourselves? So how do you approach writing memory and kind of nonfiction?
Yeah, so I think for me, like a lot of it is that I have a frightening memory. Like I think it actually frightens my husband sometimes. So I do remember a lot of things, and I think the longer you spend writing something, the more you will remember in some cases. Like for
Mm-hmm.
me, there were like writing about, there's a bit where I write about a childhood presence or monster that terrified me. And the more I revised that chapter, like I had sensory memories of like being in that bedroom as a kid and just feeling utterly horrified. So I do feel like that's one way to kind of deal with it, is to just stay longer with the project. I think it's also totally fair to say like, well, these are my essays, this is how I'm interpreting things, and to say that maybe there's someone else who sees it differently, and they can write their essays in their book. Um,
Totally
like
agree.
I think that that's what's really hard, is that like you want to make sure like you're telling the truth and you're understanding, this is how you experienced something.
Mhm.
But I think too, it would be interesting, like to sit across the table from someone else and just like slide the book and be like, what do you think?
Oh yeah,
Like,
yeah.
um,
Yeah, I think writers have various approaches to this. I'm kind of anti fact checking personally. I'm very like open to interpretation, open to bias, because I like to read biased perspectives. So I think in like a personal narrative, you have to embrace that to some degree, while also being as true as you can. I never intentionally lie, but I think I will kind of work around things that I don't remember,
mhm.
in particular. And we talked about this line in your book, Gina, of I am trying to not be afraid anymore. I'm making a lineage of what lingers. So I think that actually gives a lot of permission to a writer. It's like if they're using language in the right way. If
Mhm.
you're only making a lineage of what lingers, that really frees you. You're not saying, this is the document of how things happened. This is exactly what was said. This is exactly what happened. I think if you approach the material in the right way, it's like it just opens up, where you can allow yourself to do anything. And I think your book does that, because, like we talked about, it's going, various places chronologically. And so I hope we answered your question, Adam. That's kind of how I approach it too, is just kind of working language into it. Also using phrases like, I don't remember blank. I think that's really helpful too, because that's
Yeah.
something I go to a lot. But I think it's also good to like incorporate what to realize what you are good at remembering. Like I have a really good ear for dialogue. I remember dialogue, but not like facts from certain events. So
And I think like when you kind of do those workarounds and then you have like those really crystalline details, like that balance of like, okay, this is hazy and then this is totally what I remember, like this really cutting remark or this really specific thing. I think that's how you can kind of not only deal with, the unreliability of memory, but also like, doesn't that open up some dreaminess as well? Like,
yeah,
so
yeah,
that's another
definitely.
possibility.
Yeah. Thanks, Adam and Jenny. If anyone else has other questions, I will ask for questions if you want to do a video question, but if not, feel free to enter them in the chat. But Gina, I was wondering if you have kind of, even just a few books that you feel like really informed this book in particular, or if not books, certain films or other pieces of art, things that you really think of as that really influenced Night Rooms.
So it was a later one, and it was actually one of your recommendations.
Oh, was it?
I felt, I felt like you recommended Clarice Lispector's Agua Viva. And when I read that, I first felt really late to the party, like so belated.
I did too. I feel like I read it, a couple months before I recommended it, maybe.
Oh, so I feel
Maybe a
like there's,
year.
but is there, I feel like with enduring evergreen work, like there's no such thing as being late. I wish we would actually like
Yeah.
retire that it's just not a thing if the book is that good.
Yeah.
But reading that for me, like really cracked open my head and was like, okay, this is what a true, like, this is meditation in the truest sense. Like, I don't know what conclusions to draw from that book. Like, it is a sincere meditation on death and time and like I would say creativity and art.
Hmm.
And so reading that, I was like, okay, well, you can wander and you can like be in this kind of murky, fluid space. And so that was something that I read, before I did the final pushes on this book. But I think it really solidified like my want to like exist in both a dreamy space, but also like a really, alternating between like the kind of aphoristic writing and then like the kind of longer paragraphs. So I think that was a really formative one for me. Um, there's there's an album from the Numero group that I really love. That I'm going to recommend. It's
Yeah.
called You're Not From Around Here. And so the Numero group is an archival label, and they put out records based on like old music that they find. Like they'll go to like estate sales or whatnot. And this is supposedly the soundtrack to a noir film. And I love it. It's just so weird. It's very like twangy and dark. So I loved listening to that while I revised.
Oh, cool.
And I also listened to like the Goblin soundtrack to Suspiria.
Oh, yeah, yeah, totally.
It just felt right. And the soundtrack to It Follows was another one I like to listen to.
That's cool to know that you listen to these kinds of darker like themes and soundtracks as you wrote, because that makes perfect sense to me.
It really like gets you, for me at least, it really like induced like a lull,
Yeah.
It really like put me in a state to like just
Yeah.
wait.
For me, it's Pavlovian. It's like I'm a dog and I hear the bell and I go, okay, well I got to write. If I hear that one song or something.
Yeah.
So
You
I
like the
think it can be
Mandy.
really.
You like the
Yep.
Mandy.
I do like the Mandy soundtrack. One
That's
of the
yours,
songs
I
is
think,
really
right?
scary though. One of the songs is like, it freaks me out. I have to take it off my playlist. It's called like Black Skulls or something. I don't remember.
I love it. That's perfect.
Were there any films that were kind of influencing you beyond maybe even horror films? I'm kind of curious. Like,
Yeah. So
I'm kind of curious.
there's another David Robert Mitchell film that came out a couple years ago. It was called Under the Silver Lake, and
I love that movie. I
so
never
good.
meet people that like that movie. I love that movie. I'm so excited. Okay.
It was actually the movie I watched on Pub Day. I feel like it's like sacrilege because I wrote a book about horror movies. But what I love about that movie is it gave itself permission to be like endlessly weird and amazing and fun and dark.
Yeah.
It's actually a really bleak movie.
Yeah.
But I just love the mood of that. And so yeah, that was another one that I was just like, this is a weird movie. Basically anything where someone's like, I'm just gonna do this weird thing and if it holds my attention and I like it, I just gravitate towards that. It was also very long, and I just love that, like, I think there were I think I'd heard that like he'd been encouraged to cut it and he didn't cut it, and I just thought that was really like awesome. I love when people are just like, no, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
What it is. But yeah, that's another non-horror movie that I like.
Yeah, that also has a good soundtrack. I've written to that one too.
Oh, that's fun. Oh, maybe I'll do
It
that
does.
one next.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah.
That's great to hear. I'm just it seems like when I'm writing, I'm always looking for things that kind of give me permission to write the thing I really want to write. It's like, even if I've read a bunch of different types of work, I'm always kind of looking for that next book to help me, say, oh yeah, I can do something that does this in this way, to take like one little piece of it. And I just think that makes sense for you, of like the Agua Viva. It's so interior, but then you're so interested in cinema and different films. I think that those things are that combination is part of what makes your book so special. Just this feeling. So
yeah.
I like that. And I was just wondering if you ever feel like you will, or was there ever a point in writing this book that you felt, okay, I need to be more straightforward, or you questioned, could I write this as a kind of straightforward memoir? I'm using straightforward as just kind of, a catch-all phrase for this, of something that is just kind of chronological, doesn't take certain risks, and is just trying to keep true to the story and maybe more to the facts. Does that kind of genre of nonfiction ever appeal to you, or do you think it has to be this kind of combination of tones and lyricism and things like that?
It's so funny because I like to read, I like Gia Tolentino's Trick Mirror. I like Jenny Odell's How to Do Nothing. I love Samantha Irby. So it's like there are these other writers who I love reading, where it's like they're very like straightforward in their nonfiction, or like Tolentino, like more reporting. But for me, I'm like, I don't even know like what muscles in my brain I start using to do that. I think it would be a total overhaul for me.
Yeah.
I think sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm writing this straightforward thing, and it's totally not. Like every time I say like I'm writing something straightforward, it's like, then I like step back and I'm like, oh, you just did that thing again. I think we can change as writers, but I also think like we are who we are as writers, and like the creative DNA is there. Like, what did I read? State of Grace by Joy Williams. And I was like, oh, this is a weird book. Like it took me forever to get into that book. But once I did and just gave myself over to it, like I was like, this is really different than like other Joy Williams. But you can see like it's like a blueprint of all Joy Williams to come.
Yeah.
So I do think that's kind of interesting, is like, when someone shifts from this kind of like a very different style to like perhaps a more straightforward one. We'll see. Like it's such a weird thing. Like I know I tried like to write this in more academic ways or critical ways at points, but I was just like, this is not, I sound like professor and like I don't know what I'm talking about. And I think the readers can tell that. It's like no one wants to read a joyless book. Like even though my book is sad and dark, like it's something I wrote with love, and it's something I did because I was, I wanted to be doing it. I think if I'd gone the other way, it would have been totally not me.
Yeah, totally.
No.
I wanted to see if anyone wanted to raise their hand or ask a video question. You are welcome to at this time. Otherwise, I will continue on. Would anyone like to join us and ask a question? I'll wait a second here. Not yet. Okay, I'm going to continue on, but if I missed you, just enter the chat here. I'm happy to ask your question on your behalf. But if you want to ask a question and be on video, just let me know. I'm happy to help facilitate that. But I guess another thing I was curious about is how you approach the paragraph as a form. I think beyond this kind of overarching, thinking about how these themes are going to come and go throughout an essay, but also just the book, as a collection. How do you think on the kind of paragraph unit? Because to me, your prose your prose poetry background comes into play here, where it just feels like each paragraph is kind of its own unit. And that helps, I think, the reader kind of ground themselves in the narrative, even if they're switching gears section to section. I'm kind of curious to hear more about that. Is that something that tightens up or comes into form in revision, or is that something you think about, of like each paragraph is going to be a prose poem? Like you kind of mentioned that was how it was accumulating. Just kind of curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, and so I do think that like the prose poem, prose poetry background does come into play, but a lot of it I think happens in revision. And what's weird is that like, when I start looking at individual paragraphs, I'm really looking at like, okay, you're actually like making like a little world in each paragraph, even if it's like not a complete like argument or a complete part of the argument, like it's just one block that's part of not only the larger essay but the larger book. And so maybe I'm looking and saying, okay, well, I need to shorten this or tighten these sentences up. Maybe I'll write the paragraph backwards and the logic is reversed. So that happens sometimes. Some of the shorter ones, I think those end up just being like these kind of, sometimes those are kind of taken from longer paragraphs and set off on their own because I just want them to have their own breath. But I do think of each paragraph as its own thing, its own poem. I feel too like you could kind of like, when I read this evening, I jumped around throughout the first essay, but I still got through the whole thing and there was still kind of like a line through. So in that way too, I hope that like people can feel free to like hop through maybe the whole book. That might be a little challenging, like you might not get like the full arc of the book, but there is something to appreciate or to like rest on, I think.
Or just like a beginning, middle and end, no matter where you're reading. That's what I feel reading it. That's what's something that really impressed me, because I think that's something that gets lost in some kind of longer prose books or books of essays, is there's this kind of preoccupation with telling the whole story and not kind of unit by unit how it's feeling. And I think that's really important for the type of writing that you're doing, which is kind of more lyric and a little bit more dreamy. And you want kind of the reader to feel that there is some momentum happening. And I think I was just trying to kind of figure out, what makes your book feel that way. And I think there's a couple reasons, but I think that is one of them for me, of just kind of the appreciation of the paragraph as a unit really resonated with me. And to me, it just indicates like, oh yeah, she wrote like prose poems either before or she's treating them like it now. And maybe you could talk a little more about the theme of the final girl, because I think that's so crucial to this book. Maybe you can explain what that is for any non-horror fans in the audience, of just like what the final girl is and kind of, how that idea or theme resonated with you and kind of inspired you to become part of this book.
Yeah, so the final girl for non-horror fans is the one in the horror movie a woman or a girl who is alive at the end of a horror movie. And usually, often, she's the one who's defeated the villain or the monster, and she's the one who's outlasted everyone else. And it's something like when I think earlier drafts of this book, I wasn't like using that as much. And you were the one who pointed, you're like, this is something. And you were
I don't remember saying that, but I guess that's why I like it, because that's something that interests me now. So
so she was there, and I was writing about this idea of like the final girl, the one who survives, but I was also really interested in this idea of every person, every self you are before, and honoring like all those selves. I think at the time too that I was writing this, it was also at a time in my life where I was kind of like, well, I'm not going to write about my childhood anymore because I shouldn't write about my childhood. And so there was part of me that was like resistant to that, but then I also kind of was like pressing back against that. Like, why isn't that valid? Why isn't teen girlhood valid? Why isn't, 20, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think the final girl, the woman who survives, is not only like evidence of a person who survives in adulthood, but also like who's lived through all those other selves, all those other lives. And so I wanted to explore that more, because that's so resonant, right? Like in the movie, in Freddy Krueger, Nancy, like, a teenage girl with a man coming into her dreams, and killing all
Yeah.
her friends. Like, that's just so, it's very powerful, and it really, like, I don't know, it really moves me. So that's something that became like a big engine for the book.
Yeah. And, something that's so much about what survives. I think like that is really resonant. Kaylin, someone we both know, Kaylin Harris is asking a question. Gina, can you talk about your decision-making process with including referenced work? Was it favorite lines that run through your head while you're writing, or do you seek out these lines that fit into the essay? So you have other forms of media that inform the book and that take place in the book. So certain things from books and other forms of media. So Kaylin's asking, how did you, go about putting those in, and did you seek out those lines, or were they things that you came across?
Yeah, so there were things that I would think of when I was writing. And so, in the case of like the poetry lines, I would have to like go to my book and go to my bookshelf and pull the book and check that I was like actually quoting it right. But I'm someone who, like, I don't know, I think of lines from movies or poems, they'll occur to me. A long time ago in a poetry workshop with Kaylin, we were encouraged to keep beauty books, where we would like
Oh,
write poetry out longhand. Mary Carr had us keep these beauty books of poetry, so we would
oh wow, I
write poems
love
out
that.
longhand. And I felt like that was, it just feels really important to like have poems that you know by heart, or at least certain lines that feel like they're part of like my personal like being. I don't know, it's like leaving the house with keys. Like I should know, I should have like a couple like lines in my head when I'm walking around in the world. But also too, like I think, some of those lines from movies, they're things that just, they're the lines that stick with me and that I can't shake. Um,
Yeah.
and I tried to like write as much from memory as possible and then check after the fact, just because I thought that was like cooler. I was like, what do I remember from this scene? Like, how did it feel to watch it? And then of course, like chopping it down. But yeah, I think when you know, have those lines that resonate, that's like the ultimate praise. I think when someone like remembers something you wrote, like, and it's like an earworm, it just gets stuck.
Yeah, totally. Is that something you did in your poetry as well, or is that something that kind of worked its way into your prose,
Um,
including other work?
so I had a chapbook of poems that, uh, it's they're loose sonnets, and they begin and end with lines from Werner Herzog.
Oh, wow.
So I was writing these kind of sonnets to Herzog, about creativity and the world, and um, yeah, I feel like he's the unsung poet. He's like, he's a poet.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
great storyteller. Just even like in interviews.
Yeah, right. And so
Yeah.
yeah, so that was something I did in poetry, was like borrowing like those Herzog lines, or earlier in my first collection I did have a series where I kind of meditated on the final girl. Were like 7 or 8 poems in that collection where I kind of like dipped a toe. So it was kind of nice to like do a fuller exploration of that, and I don't know, to explore it more honestly and fully. Like those were some really weird poems. So this was a little
I
more
think
concrete.
I think there's something exciting about bringing the source of inspiration directly into the work sometimes, it has to be kind of in the right way and has to kind of earn its keep, I would say. But I
Mhm.
think there's something exciting about just bringing other people's voices literally in. Um, So I think it's really exciting when you do that in night rooms. I think we'll probably wrap up in a few minutes. So if anyone has any last questions, feel free to do it in the chat. But I was kind of curious, Gina, do you have a favorite final girl in film, in a horror film? Do you have a favorite or a couple of favorites? Kind of curious.
Yeah.
You
So
have
I
some. I
think
know they appear in the book, but
yeah. So Nancy from Nightmare on Elm Street is one favorite, because she fights Freddy, she fights the Nightmare Man. That's like amazing.
that's a good one.
Susie from Suspiria, because she's a ballerina and she faces off with the mother of sighs.
Yeah.
And Jay from It Follows, just because she's a very different kind of final girl. You know, she's tender and she's feminine, but she's not, you know, there's not like the kind of purity that I think some final girls can get caught up in. So she really resonates with me too.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think we should wrap it up here. So I don't know if Javier's going to close us out, but for anyone that's looking in the chat, these books are available with signed book plates from Exile and Bookfill. Highly recommended from me. So, and many other people. So NPR recently compared Gina to a jazz musician going in and out of her prose. I mean, the rave reviews are in. I see Javier here. Hi, Javier.
Hey, that was fantastic. Thank you guys so much. Before we close it out, I do have a couple of questions for Gina.
Yeah.
First of all, Suspiria is I'm a huge horror fan. I've been a horror fan since I was 12. I don't know what that says about me, but Suspiria is one of my all-time favorites. And I was just, the soundtrack, the Goblin soundtrack you're right, is kind of incredible. And I was wondering, what you thought about the remake of Suspiria, and do you have like maybe a few horror? It's very rare that we get horror aficionados on this show. Do you have any horror movie recommendations you can pass along?
Oh, do I ever?
This could be a whole other podcast. Let's say 5.
So in terms of new Suspiria, so I really love new Suspiria. I know there's people are torn. There are some deep, like, I don't know, some people really seem to dislike it. I like it because in some ways I feel like it was a comment on the first. There's this line Tilda says to one of the ballet instructors says to the dancer, you know, when you make the work of the dance of another, you make yourself in the image of its creator. And I feel like that movie like knows it's not original Suspiria, and it has to like live up to that. And so it does this other totally different thing. And there's something really chilly about it. There's something very, you know, where the Dario Argento is very like all the colors, the neon colors, very saturated. Yeah. And this one's very like, everything just felt very still, when it didn't. And except for that, so I liked it, and I appreciated, like, I don't know, it just was really different. And I liked the soundtrack for the new one too. Did you like it?
Tom York, right?
Yeah, Tom York. Yeah.
I did like it. I felt that the end ran a little long, but other than that, I thought it was fantastic. And I'm a remakes. I don't have to see another remake in my life. I'll be happy. And so, and that one I hold very dear to my heart. Like I loved that movie since the first time I saw it, and I'm a big Dario Argento fan. And so I went in really hesitant, but I thought they did a great job. And Tilda Swinton, I mean, can't go wrong.
Right. And I think so. That's actually, that would be, so if I'm giving recommendations, I would recommend Inferno for fans, Dario Argento's Inferno, for fans of horror or people looking to get into it. Another one I saw while I was home, so maybe it's a little more horror comedy. It's called In Fabric. It's about a killer dress. And so I thought, awesome. It kind of nods to like the giallo form, like the Italian. So I thought that was a really cool one.
And that just came out.
Within the last few years, that one came out. And then The Witch. It's not in my book, but I really love The Witch. the lighthouse might be a little too close to home right now.
Yeah.
I feel like no one wants to watch a movie about like, being in a, small space confined. But yeah, those are some like unexpected recs for people if we have horror aficionados who want something a little different.
If you haven't seen Cold Skin, it's a little reminiscent of The Lighthouse. It's based on a translated work. I forget who the author is, but it was translated from the Spanish. It was just like a Spanish translation, and it's called Cold Skin, and it's still available like on Netflix or something. But I'm excited to watch it. I've read the book and absolutely loved it, but it reminded me a lot of The Lighthouse because there's a lighthouse involved on an island and isolation and yeah.
All that fun.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Sezze. Exactly. Thank you guys so much. That was a really great event. And it was, to be honest, it was our first essay collection, our first event for an essay collection. We should just fiction. And so that was, the conversation was amazing. Thank you, Chelsea, for your amazing questions and conversation. Thank you guys both for taking the time out for this to be here. And thanks to Eliza and Eric at $2 Radio for offering up this event. We can't thank you guys enough. There we go. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. And when you purchase books by our wonderful guests, not only do you help further their writing careers, you also help Exile continue to host these virtual events and realize our goal of opening a physical space later this year. Follow the links in the chat to do so, or visit our website, exileandbookfield.com. And remember, we will send you signed book plates. I got my copy today from $2 Radio. A few things before we let you guys go. April 6th, we will host poet extraordinaire Raymond Antrobus for his new collection, Perseverance, at 7 p.m. Central. Raymond will be in conversation with Chicago's own Maurice Meyer, author of The Seventh Mansion. And then on April 7th, we host Donna Frias for her adult debut novel, The 9 Lives of Rose Napolitano, at 6 p.m. Central. And Donna will be in conversation with Kimberly King Parsons, author of Blacklight Stories. Once again, thank you guys so much, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a great evening. If you guys can stick around just for a few seconds, Chelsea
sure.
and Gina afterwards. Thank you so much. Thanks. Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.